Well, I think it's about 6:30, according to my watch. So good evening. Welcome, everybody. My name is David Corey. I am on the board of the Mothy Foundation and a faculty member at UW Green Bay in the Humanities and Modern Language program. So I want to welcome you tonight to the first of the 2026 Great Decisions Lecture Series, sponsored or organized sort of by the Foreign Policy Association. Since 2019, UW Green Bay and St. Norbert College have been co-sponsoring the series. The first year that we had it, half of them were at UW Green Bay and the other half of them were at St. Norbert. And then the pandemic hit and we pivoted, like everyone else, to Zoom, as many of you might know. And then for about the past 3 or 4 years, they've been held at St. Norbert College. And then this year, we're very honored that the Mothy Center is going to be hosting the lecture series. But we are also very grateful that we can continue this collaboration with St. Norbert College and UW Green Bay. So I want to send out a special thanks to Andalise Bolaños and Bev Moser of St. Norbert College for helping to coordinate this year's series, as well as Dr. Robert Pyne, the program director here at the Mothy Center as well, who was involved in helping arrange and set up a lot of these talks. And Abby Ledvina, who is the director, is greeting people in the hallway here at the Mothy Center. And I should also say that the series is made possible by a very generous donation by an anonymous donor, as well as the Menard Center for the Study of Institutions and Innovation, which is part of the UW system. So tonight's speaker is Dr. Robert Pyne, who is the program director here at the Mothy Center. He's likely no stranger to many of you in the audience tonight, as he has had a long and distinguished career as a teacher, educator, and a human rights advocate. He was for many years the director of the Norman Miller Center at St. Norbert College before coming here to the Mothy Center. And before moving to Northeast Wisconsin, he was a professor for a number of years, and his academic teaching and writing has focused on religion, sustainable peace, and human rights. Dr. Pyne has served on the staff and the board of several nonprofit organizations, working primarily in the fields of international peace building and refugee integration. And he's led institutional programs as well as trips to promote environmental sustainability, civic engagement, and socially responsible practices on several continents. So therefore, as you can imagine, he was a logical choice and the best choice to present tonight's talk and lead a discussion afterwards. So we want to make sure that we invite all of you to stay around for the question and answer on a very timely topic, namely the future of human rights and international law.
Thanks, David. And I need to mute this. And thank you all for coming on this rather snowy, slippery evening. It's great to see you here. And I know many of you, and that's really nice. I feel like I'm standing here among friends because that's exactly what I am. So thanks for coming out tonight. It is always both a daunting and an auspicious time to talk about human rights. There's always some horrific situation going on in the world. There's someplace right on the cusp of blowing up. And there's always a time when human rights are being violated in plain sight. At the same time, our understanding of human rights provides the language for our protest at injustice. And it frames our hope as we seek to make things right. So tonight, I'm going to begin with just a basic overview of the nature and history of human rights, and then go from there to think a little bit about human rights enforcement mechanisms and the future of human rights. I will say that the international law part of this topic is going to focus mostly on those enforcement mechanisms. And I am by no means an international law expert. I'm not a lawyer. But I will, I think, be able to help us at least frame some questions about human rights enforcement moving forward, and I look forward to that conversation. Again, I want to begin with some of the most basic ideas with regard to human rights. So last week, I was walking on a trail. This is a picture of my son on a different trail, but I was walking on a trail through a park, and there was a guy in front of me who seemed to be doing like whole body exercise. And so he's doing one of these while he's walking. Okay. And as he's walking, he's doing full arm circles. And then he would get up next to somebody and his arms would come down. And then he'd get in the open again and his arms would start flailing again. And that is as it should be. Not that you should walk like that because he looks like a dork. But if you are wanting to wave your arms around by yourself and flail as freedom lets you, then you can do that when you're walking on a trail by yourself out in the woods. Okay? But once you're near other people, you're constrained. Your ability to flail your arms about at liberty is constrained by someone else's nose. You can only wave your arms so far before you have incurred damage. And human rights is like that. Human rights is a limitation on liberty in many ways, recognizing that our liberties are constrained by other persons' rights. That if we're to be in community with one another, we can't just do as we please. We have to respect the fact that other people deserve not to be mistreated. And this goes back to some of the most basic legal codes. We can see it expressed, where from Hammurabi to the Hebrew scriptures, things like do not steal would imply a right to property. The other person has a right not to have you take their stuff. Do not commit murder implies a right to life. Someone has a right not to have you take their life while they're walking down the street. And likewise, do not bear false witness implies a limitation on free speech. Say what you want, but people have a right not to be lied about. And so those expectations, those legal codes, describe what is essentially an implication of what became full-fledged human rights much later. And there's another important thing to say about that, and that is that the ancient law codes said that even if you were a person in authority, your authority was limited by the rights of other people. You couldn't just do what you want. Women, children, and enslaved persons did not typically have the same privileges as the men who were in charge in the ancient world. That's not a surprise to us. But there were still some restrictions on the way those people in charge were to behave with regard to those who had lesser standing. You could punish them, but you couldn't punish them too severely. And I have to say, it feels harsh when we go back and read some of those ancient codes. When you go back and read some of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah, with regard to the treatment of women, some of it is pretty horrific. You know, that there was a property penalty in the case of rape, for example. It's horrific for us to read. The implication I want to draw right now is not that it was horrific, but that even then there were some limitations on the way people in great authority could behave with regard to people who had significantly less status. Now, if you chose not to abide by those rules, there were consequences from the community. You might have to pay a fine or some other kind of penalty. You might be exiled from the community. In any case, the message was clear. People have certain kind of rights, and those rights are protected by the community and its laws. And we're going to jump to a really different context, like multiple centuries, to think about some important developments that came as we transitioned into the modern world. As we think about those ancient law codes implying human rights, by the time you get to the Enlightenment, those rights are articulated plainly and rationally. And there's a reason for that. especially after centuries of religious war. It was not enough to base law on religious teaching after religious wars. It was not enough to base it on regal authority as they're beginning to challenge the authority of kings. So arguments for human rights needed to be stated, like everything else, rationally. And they were developed that way. And some really important arguments were expressed in order to describe what we think of as the first generation of human rights. Things like the right to freedom of opinion, freedom of religion, the right to self-defense, the right to the protection of one's life, the right not to be tortured, the right not to be unlawfully imprisoned. Those rights were articulated in the context of a time where people were exploring, were encountering other worlds, were encountering other people, were raising questions about the humanity of those other persons, and weren't entirely sure if those other persons that they were meeting were to be treated like beasts or treated like people. And so a really important development happened during this time, and that is that there was an increasing universalization of human rights. That initially, when you have things like the Declaration of Independence saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We know that when that was written, they really meant men. Of course, they weren't necessarily thinking we mean only men. It's just when they said men, they meant men. And they really are even consciously excluding women. Just like who would think of excluding people of color? That wasn't even on the radar. This was for landowning men. But again, as the social context is evolving and changing, not everybody was willing to stay silent about their exclusion. So when the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was, again, speaking of the rights of men, Olympia de Gouges was writing also about the rights of women. She suffered for it, but she was saying, how about us? Shouldn't we be included? And this trend toward universalization is something that it shouldn't still be going on, but it is still going on. I was going to say it shouldn't have taken as long as it did. It isn't done. You still have people having to ask, am I not a man? Am I not a woman? Am I not to be included? You still have civil rights protesters in the 1960s holding up signs, I am a man. It's because the universalization of human rights has been a long time coming, and it still will be. We're going to come back to that. There's another movement that was happening during this time, and that is that there was an expanding list of recognized rights. And that is, in an evolving social context, new questions come up. And as those new questions come up, you start to add new expectations to the list. I think of it in terms of like a massive snowball. Okay, that's a massive snowball. That's like the stories that some of you tell about how Green Bay used to be like 30 years ago. So, yeah, this is what we used to do to build a snowman, right? Okay, so when you think about building a snowball that size, you start with a core. And that core are some of these basic ideas of human autonomy, the right to life, not have your life taken, the right not to be tortured, the right again to property, some of these basic ideas. And then you layer things on. And the way it's layered on to what becomes the entire human rights corpus, first, some of the recognized rights are applied to groups that were formerly excluded. That's one. Okay. So some of those people that were of lesser status, not included, start to be included. That's one way it grows. But another way it grows is when new rights are articulated in response to social problems. So my great-grandfather was a coal miner. He died of black lung. You see the coal dust in the picture to the right. And you see the children there sorting lumps of coal and smashing. On the left, you see a child working in a glass factory, and above that, children working in a textile mill. My grandmother dropped out of school in 6th grade to work at a textile mill. And she worked sometimes up to 18-hour days. So this wasn't that long ago. Okay, I'm not that old. She wasn't that young. But still, we see an evolving situation in which the Industrial Revolution raised issues that came to be embodied in what we call a second generation of human rights. And you see some of those listed on the screen. The right to a safe work environment, the right to organize for workers, the right to a reasonable work week, the right for children not to work. A more scientific understanding of the cholera epidemic brought an emphasis on sanitation and clean water as a means of protecting a right to public health. Now, these rights, along with housing and public education and the universal right to vote, were promoted by meetings of the International Working Men's Association, founded by Karl Marx, among others, whose profound and positive influence in our history is sometimes intentionally forgotten. Talk about wiping people from history. We've wiped some of the socialists and communists from our history because in Cold War rhetoric, we didn't want to say anything positive about those who were seen as enemies. But it is important to remember that the recognition of universal human rights came through struggle. And the International Working Men's Association was the first of several internationalist movements that advanced the cause of human rights. The 20th century saw 3 more after the First and Second World Wars and after the Cold War. And each one of those moments had great hope, saw great hope, but never really lived up to its promise. So after the hopefulness of workers of the world unite, you have the world collapsing into militant nationalism with the First World War. And then the Treaty of Versailles tries to answer that with another movement of internationalism. The Treaty of Versailles establishing the League of Nations and the International Labor Organization. The ILO recovered some of these ideals that had been talked about toward the end of the Industrial Revolution. They emphasized workers' rights, eliminated child labor, called for the fair treatment of migrant workers. They established a means of international cooperation in the League of Nations, one that was intended to end war. They called it the Great War, as you know, the war to end all wars. But that didn't really work out. But it didn't work out in part because there wasn't the broad international support for the League of Nations that there might have been. It was championed by Woodrow Wilson, as you know, but never ratified by the United States. And we didn't stand behind it. And in part, it may have asked too much of some of the defeated enemies of the First World War. Cliff Gaignard here can tell you more about that. He's a historian of early 20th century Germany. And the League of Nations, or rather the Treaty of Versailles, expected a lot from them, and it didn't work out. So that as a result, you have a return to militaristic nationalism in a way that is all too familiar. In the Second World War, 85 million people died in Europe. 40 million were displaced. The results were horrific, profound, life-shattering, world-shattering. The Holocaust made people want to find a way somehow to say never again, but how to say it and how to enforce it. The United Nations, established in 1945, by 1948, came up with a couple of important documents. One was the Genocide Convention that tried to define and describe what to do should anyone ever try to do something like that again. The other statement that was critical was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UDHR was drafted in this remarkable process that was widely international and what we might even consider intercultural or interfaith, because they sent questionnaires. UNESCO sent these questionnaires to leaders, religious leaders, government leaders, thought leaders around the world, philosophers, and asked them to respond to what was an initial draft of what they considered potential human rights, and to offer their support for that list, but then also to describe any additions that they might want to have. Gandhi got one of those questionnaires in the mail. That'd be kind of cool. It'd be kind of cool to get one of those questionnaires. What do you think? We have such respect for you. We're going to give you one of these questionnaires to answer on behalf of a whole swath of the world. Well, they found that they agreed to a great degree on what should be on the list for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But Jacques Maritain, who was leading that process, wrote about it. He said, we agree with regard to the rights, but don't ask us why. And what he meant by that is some people ground it in their faith. Some people grounded it in rationality. Other people grounded it more historically or philosophically. They came to many of the same conclusions, but they might try to defend those conclusions differently. That's fine. That worked. And they came out with this Universal Declaration of Human Rights that becomes the standard for nations becoming a part of the UN. That every nation coming into the UN follows that and says, we're in. We support that. Now, one thing that the Universal Declaration had was all these opinions. One major thing it didn't have was teeth. It didn't have any enforcement. It's a list of wonderful ideals. But if you violate those, you violate. There's no penalty. But United Nations, they're not fools here. So what they did is add a whole bunch more conventions. These have teeth. Okay. The rest of the international human rights conventions are also coupled with enforcement mechanisms. And those enforcement mechanisms vary by convention. Now, the ones listed there are a lot, and they run all the way up to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2006. Those are what the UN referred to as core human rights documents. There are other treaties as well, and there are optional protocols tacked onto these. But each of these committees, or rather each of these conventions came with a committee. And those committees are charged with the enforcement of the treaty provisions, the treaty agreements. And so just a quick aside about the enforcement structure connected to this UN regime of human rights. Again, each of these committees made up of different people chosen in different ways, established by the conventions. And not every nation has agreed to each one of those. In fact, there are quite a few here that the United States has never agreed to. We're not necessarily great at that. We're going to come back to that point too. But the nations that have agreed to them typically also are asked to come and present reports to the committee about how they're doing on the specifics. So about 12 years ago, I attended in New York a meeting of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. It is the enforcement committee for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Both the convention and the committee are rather inconveniently known as CEDAW. Okay, so I went to the CEDAW committee, and the CEDAW committee at that time was hearing reports from 4 different countries. And those reports were asking really specific questions, like, you promised in joining this convention that women would have access, the same access as men, to bank loans. How you doing on that? How about inheritance? Do they have inheritance rights the same as men? Are they able to join contracts the same way as men? Have you eliminated child marriage? How have you eliminated it? Do women have equal right to custody of children in your country? These are the kinds of questions that they have to answer in front of the committee. Now, I compare it a little bit to university accreditation. David, have you ever been on an accreditation committee? It's fun, right? So with accreditation, every college and university is accountable to a set of standards that they report on periodically. What is it, every 10 years? Okay, unless you're in trouble, then it's like every 5. Okay, so every 10 years, the provost gets all agitated, puts together a committee, and that committee, they're assigned different pieces, and the different pieces are attempting to answer different parts of the accreditation criteria. How many books do you have in the library? How many of your professors have terminal degrees? What is your class size? What are what's your discount rate on scholarships? And they ask all these questions that you have to answer and document. Now, a university, we won't tell this to the provost, can BS their way through that process. They can kind of, collect the best quotations, get the best student opinions, and they can they want to make themselves look good, right? And likewise, countries can BS their way through this kind of UN process, but here's the thing. They are publicly attempting to talk the language of human rights and say, we're doing pretty well. Publicly, they are trying to say, in the case of CEDAW, that they are advancing human rights. And they are saying that to the world, because assembled nations are here listening to their report and asking hard questions. And if they get pinged on one of those reports, like say they say, well, yeah, we let women vote, they just don't vote. Well, come on. We know they'll vote if they can. So if they're not voting, you got to fix that. And so next time they're back in front of the committee, they have to answer that particular problem. Just like a university, if they say, hey, you don't have enough books in the library, well, now they probably don't say that anymore because they're all electronic. But if they ping you on something, you've got to answer it next time, or there will be consequences. Those consequences, in the case of these committees, are typically shame. Shame works if you have shame. If you're shameless, it doesn't work so well. Okay, and that highlights another aspect of the International Human Rights Conventions and enforcement, that there are a lot of NGOs and nonprofits out there whose whole work, like Human Rights Watch, their work is to name, blame, and shame governments that are dropping the ball on human rights. And they do it really well. But again, if the government is shameless, it only goes so far. The top two, I meant to advance the slide. The top two here, I don't know why it's asking me to turn up my volume. I'm not going to do that. The charter bodies connected to the UN Charter have human rights enforcement for the entire UN. I mean, the entire all the member nations. The treaty bodies, these over here, are relevant only for those who have ratified those treaties. Okay, so interestingly, when I was at CEDAW in New York, there was no U.S. representation on that committee. There were no U.S. reports to that committee because the U.S. never ratified the treaty. So essentially, we're saying those rules don't apply to us. And so that committee has no authority over us. The others do, though. If a complaint is made to the Human Rights Council about something happening in the U.S., as let me rephrase that, the Human Rights Council receives about 45,000 communications every year from parties saying that some country or another is doing human rights violations. That's a lot to sift through. And as they sift through them, sometimes they'll pass those on to other enforcement mechanisms, specifically the treaty bodies, and say, this looks credible, go with it. But when you make those charges, those accusations, they'll want to know, did you exhaust all local authority first? Have you exhausted local government? Have you exhausted federal government? Do you need to bump this up to a world authority? And again, a lot of people do believe they need to do that. And when they do, these enforcement bodies jump into it. But when we think again about that whole process, it's cumbersome. It's long. It might not be immediately life-saving. Somebody might make a complaint and it's going to funnel through that system, and it is going to take a while before they get to it. Right now, I saw that the International Criminal Court was taking up a case from 2017. Okay. International Criminal Court, by the way, is independent of this process established by the Rome Statute, which the U.S. also did not sign up for. But the process is long and it's cumbersome. And another reason why it became cumbersome is that when we think back to this whole ebb and flow of nationalism and internationalism that has gone through the 20th century, and the hopes of the internationalist moments and the militant nationalism that then followed, all of the hope of the UN system kind of ground to this slow, not to a halt, but just to a slow progress during the Cold War. For example, this covenant, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, many in the US love that one. Those are first generation rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. We never signed up for the next one, economic, social, and cultural rights. Those are really particularly popular in many of the former Soviet bloc countries. So, for example, when Barack Obama was in Cuba, meeting with Raul Castro, he lightly chided Castro for press freedoms and said, you need to do a little better on your freedom of the press. And Castro said, well, maybe, but you need to do a little better on your right to health. So, yeah, okay, got it. Yeah, good point. And so that was an example, though, of the kind of stalemate that often happened during the Cold War, where what might have been a hope for joint progress instead kind of got to a you do this, we do that, and canceling one another's resolutions in the Security Council. And it didn't really yield all that we hoped. But then came another moment, the fall of the Berlin Wall. After the Cold War, there was significant optimism that all this would change, that a more resolute UN human rights regime would contribute to a new age of international freedom. Apartheid came to an end in South Africa. And in 1993, a tribunal was established to investigate war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity in the former Yugoslavia. It was a hopeful moment. But none of that was enough to prevent genocide in Rwanda in 1994, or a decade later in Darfur. And ultimately, the promise of human rights enforcement lost out to the practicalities of economic globalization, rising inequality, international terrorism, war, refugee movement, pandemic, and resurgent nationalism. And in all of that, the hopefulness of a broad human rights regime began to shatter. The image on the left is René Casson, who was part of the original drafting committee for the Universal Declaration. And he said that it consisted of multiple pillars: human dignity, like some of the grounding rights, civil liberties, first generation rights, social equity, second generation rights, and national solidarity, what are called third generation rights. Micheline Shai, who is a professor and scholar in human rights, has said that the pillars, civil, political, socioeconomic, cultural, and security, after the Cold War were effectively split up. This is an important point. They were appropriated left and right by self-interested parties and movements. Progressives use the language of economic rights against corporate greed. Realists embrace the right to national security. Liberals focused on cultural rights and the politics of identity, and libertarians claim civil and political rights. And it's splintered. And as a result, what was supposed to hang together like that giant snowball I showed you, instead melted and shattered into fragments. Philippe Villopillon, the executive director of Human Rights Watch, said human rights are never ensured. The freedoms we hold dear were won piece by piece after the catastrophes of the 20th century, when governments accepted, however imperfectly, that state power should be constrained by law, institutions, and a shared baseline of human dignity. But today that architecture is buckling. It's buckling again because everybody took chunks of the whole human rights regime rather than embracing the whole. It's also buckling because the main power behind human rights enforcement and advocacy worldwide has stepped off the stage. That Trump's foreign policy has been an America First policy that in its nationalism doesn't have much concern about human rights enforcement, at least not rhetorically. Well, not actively either. One might say that previous administrations were more talk than action in many ways. And that could be a fair criticism. Right now, it seems we have neither talk nor action. In an interview with the New York Times, Trump was asked, "Do you see any checks on your power on the world stage?" He said, "Yeah, in my mind, my own morality." New York Times said, "Not international law? I don't need international law." You know, when Trump says the only thing stopping him is his own sense of morality, there is a word for that, and that is monarchy. If other people were to say it alongside him, there's a word for that, and that is anarchy. It's not what we would think of as a standards-based, law-based system of justice. The conservative blogger Matt Walsh said international law is fake and gay. The only international law is that big and powerful countries get to do what they want. That's not very encouraging. But that is where we are. So as we think about the future of human rights, again, quoting from Philippe Villopillon of Human Rights Watch, He says the rapid shift in Washington's posture, dismantling the post-World War II order that it helped to build, has exposed a hard truth. The system cannot depend on any superpower. The answer to our challenges isn't nostalgia for yesterday's system. It's to construct a human rights alliance of rights-respecting democracies that are capable of defending core norms when powerful states, read US, defect. In the same vein, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at Davos urged the middle powers to develop a new world order rooted in shared values. He said that will enable them to earn the right to principled stands by reducing their vulnerability to retaliation. See, if we're going to be the bullied and get our way through economic bullying, a topic that will come up later in this series when we think about tariffs and their effect, or the effect of their threats, then essentially other countries have to figure out how to go it alone and stand up to those threats, how to stand up to the bully together. And that is already happening now. But I would suggest that is only part of the answer. And it's not enough of an answer. We need to remember, whether we like it or not, that we are, in fact, part of a larger community. In 2006, I made the first of many visits to Rwanda. My friends there took me to see Nehemiah Church, where in 1994, during the middle of the 100 days in which nearly 1 million people, mostly Hutus, or rather mostly Tutsis, were slaughtered by Hutus, mostly by machete, in the Rwandan genocide. At this particular church, a pastor, I use the word loosely, told Tutsis they could seek shelter from marauding bands. So about 9,000 people sought shelter in a space about twice the size of this room. And the pastor then turned them over to the Interahamwe, which was the Hutu militia. And they blew a hole in the door. You can still see the broken door on the right side of that image. And they killed everybody inside in the course of about 24 hours. I'm not going to show you those pictures. That memorial is still vivid. They have a mass grave outside, down buried, you can walk into. They have inside piles of bloodied clothing. There are shrapnel holes in the ceiling. There's blood as high as the top of the altar. It's horrific to go in there. But I want to call your attention to this sign that was outside the door on my first visit. In Kinyarwanda, it says, if you knew who you were and you knew who I was, you would not have killed me. If you knew who you were and you knew who I was, you would not have killed me. And so I want to conclude by coming back to what is for me the most basic question. And that is, why is it so hard for us to remember who we are? Why is it so hard for us to remember that human rights are universal? Why have some groups had to work so damn hard for so damn long to be recognized as human? And quite simply, there are a lot of people, there have been and are, a lot of people who haven't wanted to share their privileged status. They have refused to believe that all humans were created equal. White supremacists and patriarchalists have argued that other races or women are consigned to servitude by divine condemnation, genetic determinism, or constitutional weakness. They've tried to support those beliefs by appealing to scripture, science, or common knowledge. That is, an appeal to the status quo. And those arguments, while simply false, have a remarkable staying power when they are used to preserve privilege. More recently, a different kind of opposition to universal human rights has come from the left, from cultural relativists who argue that every culture or subculture should be left to develop and enforce their own values. Universal human rights, they have said and would say, are an imposition of Western thought, a colonizing philosophy that forces other people groups to adopt the values of the European Enlightenment. And I have to say, such critics would have had to remain silent in the fight against slavery, justified as it was as a scriptural principle that was at the heart of the Southern way of life. If rights are socially formed and culturally relative, who's to say they were wrong? And likewise, if rights are socially formed and culturally relative, who gets to define what the particular values of that culture are? In the case of the South, was it the white slave owner? They were the ones with the voice and the authority. Is it those who are in power retaining privileges for themselves? Is it the religious leader who defines roles and boundaries for society based on antiquated documents and doctrines that not everyone accepts? Who gets to decide? In any case, cultural relativism doesn't do anything but preserve the status quo. It's advocates watching history like anthropologists with field notebooks. On the other hand, the notion of universal human rights does not favor the powerful or the privileged of any society or historical era. It consistently challenges the patterns of oppression to which the powerful revert. Universal human rights simply states that there are no lesser persons, and that rights are not determined on the basis of race, skin color, sex, language, religion, political opinion, birthplace, class, or geographical location. And that says something also incredibly important about the way we live together in the world. It says that all humans are deserving of protection, and they are to be protected even from those under whose authority they abide. And that's true at every level of society, from neighborhoods to the international community. Nobody, even the president of the most powerful nation, has unlimited authority over the lives of people in their country, over the lives of people in other countries, or over the lives of people on the high seas. And national self-determination does not excuse human rights violations any more than a "my house, my rules" sign gives you a free pass to commit abuses in your own home. Universal human rights do not come and go with international borders. They do not disappear behind property lines or closed doors. In other words, believing in universal human rights means you might have to get up into some other people's business, whether individuals or nations. It might mean outside authorities or states stepping in to prevent abuses. It might mean stepping up to ensure that your neighbor has shelter, clean water, food, and healthcare. In the US, polls show that people generally support the idea of human rights. Like everyone, we all want the broadest and most all-encompassing experience of human rights. We want all of them for ourselves. But Americans, as I hinted before, don't really want anybody in the international community coming and telling us what to do. We also don't know that we want to pay for other people's experience of human rights. Like we're all for not making them stop talking. You know, they have freedom of speech, they can talk. But when you think about positive rights, that is what they should be provided, not just what they shouldn't be denied, but what they should be provided. And you think about things like healthcare, clean water, food, shelter. We'd be perfectly happy to have them have it. We just don't necessarily want to pay for it, even if it's our own neighbors. In other words, we like the language of human rights. We just don't necessarily like the actions of human rights. And we tend to like the status quo, especially if we have the upper hand. So for about 10 years, I taught a class in which we tracked global indicators for poverty, longevity, child mortality, access to clean water, and other indicators of human flourishing. And every year up until the pandemic, when it hit a bit of a slide, those numbers significantly improved. The pandemic showed how fragile those things are, showed how fragile poverty, or our fight against poverty was, because a lot of people slid back into extreme poverty. The Trump administration has demonstrated that political rights, too, are way more fragile than we thought. But nevertheless, I do believe that human rights progress will continue in the long run, whether we're on board with that or not. I believe that human rights describes human aspiration. It's what the people want. I believe it will come. I believe it will continue. But nationalism says we can do it alone. And ultimately, that's a lie. We can't. We're in this together. And the sooner we admit that and contribute to the future of human rights in the context of international law, the better. For us and for the world. So I'll leave it at that and then take any questions. Zakaria is going to help with that. So, thanks.
Does anybody have any questions so far? I can ask a question.
Oh, man.
You talked about cultural relativism and how the danger of that can be if we just let everybody do what they want. But how do we know we have the right culture, the right ideas, and maybe we're the wrong ones? What's that line that we can draw?
That's a great question. So I always believe in the intellectual humility of saying we might be wrong. But I also recognize when you're in the great majority, you've got a pretty good chance of being on the right track. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, again, it's not perfect, but it's a pretty great summary of things that people want. And it's not that people don't want those for themselves in general. I think, again, this represents human aspiration writ large. Where we disagree is sometimes how particular cultures express and manifest what they believe to be, say, for example, the rights of women. That's an easier one to talk Some people will say that in their culture, women have a greater right to be protected and treated as mothers and wives with dignity and not exposed to the critical world in which they could possibly be assaulted or injured, that they're better protected when sheltered. And to that, I would say, let them choose what they want. Do they have an option of choosing the kind of life that they want? Or is that life being chosen for them by men who would treat them as possessions? That if you treat somebody with respect, it means honoring their choices and honoring what they want for themselves, rather than telling them what's good for them. And all too often, there are people who use even their religious faith or their cultural identity to tell others what's good for them. And when I think about the intersection of religion and human rights, because it is often religious people who create the limitations. I mean, it's the religious people in this country that are the reason why we didn't ratify CEDAW. That's on those who were afraid that it would lead to a nationalization of abortion rights. And they didn't want that. And so they opposed it. And so for the religious voices, and Steve Hartman and I have had lots of conversation about this, I would say if your religion is of the sort that causes you to promote human rights and alleviate poverty and stand on the side of the oppressed and try to make the world a better place where humans flourish, if your religion does that, bring it to the public sphere. We need it. We need that voice. But if your religion is of the sort that tells certain people they have to remain secluded, that tells certain people they have to dress a certain way, or they have to behave a certain way in order to conform with your expectations of morality, would you please keep that part private? That what we need is an expansive view of human freedoms and flourishing that happens when people are advocating for what is good and right, not just for themselves, but for others. Yes.
I love what Ron just used.
Well, he's bringing the microphone so that it can catch it on the recording. Thanks.
What, and when I say we, I don't mean necessarily the people in this room, but generally, what do we tell people who are in groups that appear to be on the short list for targeting, for limiting or worse their human rights? I would have told in Germany, I know we use Germany as what would I have done in the 30s, you know, but I mean, I would have told my disabled, you know, my friends who had disabled loved ones, my friends who were LGBTQ, though they didn't call it that then, my friends who were Jewish, to leave.
Yeah.
I would not have said to stay. Do we do that? And I don't mean just now, although I'm worried about now, but do we do that throughout history when we sense that there is an exponential growth in the desire to limit human rights? Or do we do the you know, French Revolution thing, you know? And I'm really genuinely asking you because you have seen it up close in recent time, and I don't know what to tell people. And I have students who ask me that too. I tell them what I think, but I wish I knew better what experts thought.
Cliff, I'm going to invite you to jump in on this too, if you want. Speaking of experts, so I'll make it real personal. Okay, the guy that just handed you that microphone was born in Kenya. He's a U.S. citizen. every time he travels, I say, "So, Zakaria, how was it?" And I was relieved this time. I hope I'm not overspeaking. I was relieved when he came back from a most recent trip, and he said it was great that he came through the airport and showed his passport, and they said, "Welcome home." Okay, that gave me some hope, but I am nervous for him. And I'm nervous for other students and friends. I have told people to accumulate passports if they can. And I think they should. I'm an educator, so I tend to think that I can help move things forward with words. And sometimes that gives me too much confidence in my voice and not enough confidence in my feet. But I know some of you have been out marching and demonstrating, and you've been standing up for what you believe is right, so that it doesn't come to this, so that it doesn't get worse. And you're seeking to make it right in multiple ways, calling legislators, writing letters, doing all these things. All that's good. But when it comes to protecting people, I want to see that the people I know are safe and well. And so, for example, I know there were people who were seeking shelter in the homes of friends and family in Minneapolis. And there were people from here who were bringing halal food to Minneapolis just to offer some expression of help. So I know that's happening. It's awful to think that it would have to happen here. I'd invite any other thoughts, ideas. Cliff, I called you out. I don't know if you have anything else to add, but any other thoughts about how to stand up for what's right in the midst of potential tyranny. I think of the wonderful little book on tyranny by Timothy Snyder that has several short chapters about what to do to prevent it from happening here. That's helpful. Any other thoughts? David?
I think one thing towards the end of your remarks, you said something about, we're all in it together, but nationalism tells us we can go it alone.
Yeah.
Do it alone. But I think nationalism also says rights are for our people and not for the others. And that's a more fundamental problem. And I think that immigration is one of the central challenges that really question human rights around the world. And it's become now, rights, but rights for our people and not for the other.
Right.
And that's a huge backslide. And I see nationalism growing and exclusionary nationalism across the world. And that is an ideology that is in many ways fundamentally opposed to the universalization of human rights, or universalization of rights. And I think that the key is how you can connect rights with universal human rights. And nationalism seeks to appeal to something that chips away at that, so that you see an us and them, we have rights, they don't. And I think the policies going on the past year or so with the immigrants are showing they don't have any rights. We can send you to a third country, put you in prison, and you have no mechanism of even challenging your own detention because that person doesn't have any rights.
Right.
And as more of a comment, I don't know what the answer is.
David, you can't raise hard things like that without answering. I think you're exactly right. And I've made a number of trips to Sweden. And one of the reasons I was going there was to compare our system with immigration and refugee resettlement in particular with theirs. And one of the things I was seeing initially was that they were unbelievably generous, in part because they do believe in economic, social, and cultural rights. So refugees were welcomed as new arrivals and immediately were given access to universal basic income, to healthcare, to education, to language training, to ultimately to jobs, all managed by the municipalities. It was remarkable. But the popularity of those programs drew a lot of people. And it also raised some concerns from the political right. So the political right parties began becoming more popular and opposing those kinds of services offered to refugees. And so they began to shut it down. And you see the resurgent nationalism happening there too. So how does one counter resurgent nationalism except with reminders, I have to say it again, of who we are? You know, we all know and have said way too many times we are a nation of immigrants. I know a few of you, and I know a few of your stories. I know you've come from a lot of places. There is a tendency, sometimes even among those who come from places, to pull up the ladder behind them. And we need to remember who we are. And maybe that sounds shallow and moralistic. I would like to think that we would also have a strengthened UN system that recognizes the need to appeal something to a higher level. You know, right now, again, if you make an appeal about human rights violations to the UN, you're saying that the local authorities have been maxed out. We've done all we can locally. And it may be that when you look at pockets of nationalism, they've done all they can locally. It might be that we have to help one another internationally through those expressions of nationalism. It might be the only way we are challenged in our nationalism is if Carney and other world leaders are successful in gathering their middle powers together to stand against our economic pressure, so that we can see through their challenge that we can't do it alone, that it's not just us, that our foreign policy can't look like the strategic plan that Trump published in November or whenever it was, that basically said we get to do whatever we want in the world. You know, maybe we need that challenge. And I have some American patriot friends who are hoping that Carney and other internationalists are successful in standing against US tariff pressure, even if it costs us in the short run, so that we can rejoin the international community. Okay, I told you, Don, it would not be a great decisions lecture if you didn't ask a question. So get that man a microphone.
The first one, just like.
It wasn't the first one. It usually is. But I've been a part of this series for a long time, and you always ask one of the questions.
So, judging by the state of affairs in the world, the recurrence of egregious violations of human rights, one can't escape the conclusion that our current institutions are insufficient and not effective at all.
I would qualify. I wouldn't say at all. They're not as effective as they could be, but they do some. Okay, keep going.
Yeah. So my question is, what do we do?
Yeah.
I mean, we live in a very sophisticated world that certainly is the capability, but many of Western democracies that purport to be supporters of human rights fail dramatically. They trade with countries that are repeated violators of human rights. Mm-hmm. So how do we bring teeth into Because in the 21st century, things that we've witnessed just recently in Iran should never happen.
I knew you were gonna get Iran in there. Okay, let's think very specifically about that, okay? So, I don't know what the actual number of protesters in Iran who were killed, I don't know the actual number. As you know, I'm sure, estimates range from 6,000 to 40,000, okay? The threat is of to enforce R2P, responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect says if abuses are happening behind the closed door of a country, it is incumbent upon other nations to do something about it. And what would that be? Well, it might mean some type of military intervention if economic intervention isn't enough. Okay, so that could be, but ideally, that would happen through the mechanism that's also enshrined in R2P, which would be of recognized international bodies. So not just a individual nation like ours deciding that we're going to be the ones to do it, but an international body like maybe NATO, maybe other regional authorities to say, we're going to do this together. The Security Council still produces a stalemate too many times. We know that, but to go through the process of honoring international law while acting in international intervention, rather than doing so as a rogue nation that gets to do what we want. So that's an initial answer. You're right, not enough. There haven't been enough teeth. There hasn't been enough willingness to intervene, and that willingness to intervene. Sometimes we wait so long that things go really, really, really bad before we do anything about it. And that's what the regular reporting structure is supposed to alleviate within the UN. That you're nipping things in the bud, as it were, before they become bigger problems. We haven't done that well. But I would like to believe that the initial structures are there if we would support them more sufficiently. It has been to our advantage not to support a stronger UN. I would like to think that we would see it as our advantage, in fact, to support a stronger international body so it doesn't always just fall on us. Okay, we'll talk some more after. Thanks. Okay, I am going to let you go, but we can stick around and talk. I will say there are a lot of really significant topics to be addressed in this series. They're going to be picking up other themes of this internationalism versus nationalism, the possibility of multilateral institutions, a lot of great topics coming up. So I hope to see you again out here. Thanks.